Summing up a discussion on popular culture is no easy thing because popular culture encaptures so much of our world. I would like to be able to make the difference to you when we talk about the difference between art and commerce that intersects so many of these things. We have to remember that in popular culture, there is art as well. That some things get big, get popular because they're actually very good. Now, there's a combination of things that have to come along with an artist becoming successful in popular culture. And part of that combination is that they have to be like legitimately able to do something new, and they have to be very lucky and be in the right place at the right time in order to maintain any sort of viewership, listenership, readership, whatever, to have a big publisher that has some money behind it these days. It's very rare that things go without padding the pockets of executives within one company framework or another: television, recording, book publishing, movie companies. And so many of these conglomerates are owned by the same company. And that's part of where the lines between popular culture and commercialism begin to get really sticky. And when we recognize how much influence popular culture has over us, we recognize how much it changes our view of ourselves. And this comes through the psychological concept of thrownness, that where and when you were born, the influences in the environment around you that are not under your control, that were never part of your choice, are going to influence many of the ways that you see yourself, that you see the people around you, and that you derive meaning from the world. But the way that these blend with, commercial culture can become really overwhelming when you consider that the right people in the right place with the right power can move a populace towards putting their efforts into padding the pockets of a few wealthy people at the top. Now, yeah, we get to be a little bit cynical about this because despite all of the silver linings that we can see in the fantastic artists or quality television or meaningful movies or whatever that we have out in front of us, that is really the tip of the iceberg. It's really not the normal thing to see the artist make it. It's really not the normal thing to see the person who's highly capable become the one in the spotlight. I'm speaking very broadly here about lots of different media, and it's always helpful to have something good there, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, so let me get a little bit specific here without calling out any, fan bases or whatever. When you look backwards, you look back at television in the 50s, television in the 80s, television in the 90s, like whatever it is that you're seeing when you look back, whether you're watching reruns or listening to a older family member wax on about how much better their shows were than the shows that are out now, it's important to remember that you're looking at like the top 5% of shows back then. That we're always looking back at about the top 5%, that 95% of the material does not carry over. So a lot of popular culture in retrospect is a lot of the really good artistic stuff that survived. And that's nice to know, that things that stand the test of time tend to be of a more penetrating, higher quality than things that are just thrown at you to try and move you towards the buying, purchasing, or perpetuation of what you're doing. This isn't always the case, but if we look back at the very best shows of the 50s, 60s, I Love Lucy, look back at the 80s, Cheers, 90s, Seinfeld, in the 2000s had quite a few shows on that. Really, television started getting a lot better in the 2000s, and we feel like we've really been in a golden age of television for quite a while now, where the budgets for television are higher, the storylines are more complex, and the overall quality of what it is that you can watch on television has really soared in the last few years. And I can think of many examples, but just to pull out two, Breaking Bad and Mad Men are absolutely fantastic shows that could not have existed in a previous time because of budget constraints, because of the way storytelling was on television, because of the way people access television shows now has evolved, makes a big difference in what is capable. So you look back at the top 5% or whatever, and it's easy to get nostalgic and think that whatever time period is you're looking at has the best of the things. But very often that's just, the cream of the crop. You look back at music in the 60s, and if you think of the Beatles, they were artists. They got lucky. They were in the right place at the right time. They got with the right producer. They had the right sort of control. You look back at Miles Davis in the 60s, same thing. Like, not only a very talented jazz musician, but also had an eye for controlling what was going on in the studio, for working with the very best people in the business. And this is rare, when it comes down to it, that things don't sound like they just came out of a production mill. So that's one of the things that really gets to us, is just how much stuff is there. If we cut out the 95%, what did things look like with that other 95% thrown in there? And we can do this all over the place. Look back at popular literature from the Victorian era, and you're looking at some really excellent works by some really talented authors. But man, there was a lot of trash running around too. Just absolute tripe. Just stuff that never should have seen the light of day. Just like there is today. But here's the thing. Here's what's so insane about the world today, is that if you take all of the media ever made, all of the stories that were written down, all of the songs that were written and recorded, all of the movies, and this is 20th century heavy when we get to it. When you look back at history and you take all of the media ever produced, from Gilgamesh on clay tablets on down, and you go from the dawn of humankind to 2006, okay? The dawn of humankind to 2006, let's call this one unit of measurement. Let's call this one human media. I don't know what I would call it that, but that's what we're calling it. So all of the dawn of time to 2006 is one unit. That same amount has been produced every 3 days since 2006. Yeah. Every 3 days, humankind has produced that same amount of information as it took us tens of thousands of years to produce. We have more inputs these days than anybody could have ever dreamed of. If you want to be in a painting contest with, Da Vinci, just keep in mind that it's not fair, because you've seen so much more than he has. I mean, for one thing, you've seen all of his works, and you've seen all of his contemporaries, and you've seen what comes after. But beyond that, you've seen stuff from other continents. You've seen stuff from other, developments of art through different, artistic genetics. The same goes for music. If you want to say that you're a better composer than, well, don't say you're a better composer than Bach, but if you think about the musical inputs that Bach had, how many songs he heard in his lifetime, how many performances he attended, how many times he played, it's a lot of music. But it's nothing compared to how much you can just latently, accidentally hear today. We may not be paying as deep attention, and our brains may not be made to understand it quite as detailed as somebody like that did. But you're hearing music not just from the Renaissance and the Baroque period like he had. You're hearing music from the classical, the romantic, the modern, the postmodern, the contemporary. But beyond that, that's just the Western music. You're also hearing music that was influenced by creators in Africa, Indonesia, India, Japan, all of these places that had completely different genetic to their music, different scales, different intervals, different rhythms that didn't exist in his world. You have a much broader diversity of exposure. Think about how many plays Shakespeare went to in his life. I couldn't possibly tell you how many plays Shakespeare went to. I have no way of even sitting down with an envelope and writing out just even a rough calculation of what that could have possibly been. But I can tell you this, by the time you were 6 years old, you saw more stories than he did. By the time you were 6 years old, you saw more performances than he would ever see. And yeah, all of those performances, if you're watching them in English, they're all utilizing words and phrases and references that he created. So that's cool. But you still have seen so much more than he has. We live in a world that has just never existed before. But one thing about the world that we live in is we are so exposed that sometimes the voices of the people who we watch on television come through us. That sometimes our inner monologue will begin to mirror the way of talking that one of our favorite television stars may have. We may begin to picture our body movements the same as Don Draper's, for example. This is part of why the cigarette smoking in television was so pervasive, because people begin to see themselves through what they're exposed to. And since we're exposed to so much, it could be anything that you start seeing yourself as, video game characters, movie characters. I'd be a little optimistic to say literary characters. Like, for example, if I read a lot of Mark Twain, which I do sometimes, I'll go on a little Mark Twain kick and read a bunch of his work. If I read a little bit of Mark Twain, I notice my writing becoming verbose like his is. I try to mirror some of his cleverness. His influence is really hard to shake. But that's the thing, is all of this influence is hard to shake, and it's all around us all the time. And when you and your friends get together and hang out for a weekend and recognize that 75% of what you said is movie quotes, 75% of what you said and done are pop culture references, it begins to give you an idea of what the scope and influence of this massive media machine have on you and how you see yourself. Now, this is nothing new. This is nothing new. Referencing things is part of the way a culture creates and perpetuates itself. Referencing, common experiences, referencing common stories. Just for example, a lot of things Shakespeare invented, but the basic stories he was telling existed before he did. That he has characters echo the words and sentiments of ancient poetics. He references, Greek mythology constantly. And when we start to recognize that, like, all of poetry references Shakespeare, and all of the ways that we write stories spring out of this Wheel of Fortune structure that he created. He didn't create, but he really fleshed out. We begin to see that we're a culture that constantly is digesting and replaying itself in so many ways. Operas, which weren't invented until the 1600s, were generally echoing Greek mythology or the gods or whatever, because these were the basic elements of what we saw as being human. And then later operas reference those operas, and it carries on. I mean, the last musical that I went to, Hadestown, is a retelling of Orpheus, for God's sake. And I mean, it's not even veiled. It's just a retelling of Orpheus, a story that's been around for thousands of years. Just write some new music to it. The music's inspired by all sorts of structures. It's music's inspired by, for example, Bach. Bach created the intervals by which we hear notes. He really popularized the type of tuning that we use. And he also created a structure where things and phrases are repeated, but they're never repeated 3 times without changing a little bit. And every song does that now. So we see even our most modern media echoing elements of our culture, and that's powerful stuff. We see it also in sports. So many sports metaphors have penetrated the business world, which is part of, the overall sexism of the business world, creating phrases and references that are not common to everyone, but tended to be common to the men who were in charge of things. People who had the leisure time to watch and follow sports in the interest, for whom it was fashionable, began to speak through the vernacular of sports stuff. Great meeting in there. You hit a home run. All right, you've got them on the ropes. You're at the 1-yard line, push a little further. All of these thinly veiled references to common experiences. And common experiences for us now could be the first time you watched Star Wars. We could both sit and reminisce about that as if it was something we did together. I remember one time my roommate in college and I talking about the difficulty of fighting the mother brain in Metroid. How hard it was, how the screen slowed down, the sweat just pouring off your brow. And then when you've killed her and you have to escape, the stress of that. And we hadn't known each other back then. And yet video gaming gave us this common experience. I could sit down with any one of you and talk about individual tracks in Mario Kart as if you and I were there together, which we were not. Our media has become part of the world that we inhabit, and it inhabits us. The two things bleed together. So it seems important that we try and observe this. We can observe it with cynicism, with wonder. We can observe it without judgment. Because it seems important to distinguish what part of this is me, and what part of this was given to me, and what part of this was sold to me. And these days, it goes a little further than that because, we've talked a lot about the way commercials work and the way they try to create stereotypes and perpetuate them so that we may see ourselves through these stereotypes so that we may have predictable and influenceable buying patterns. And that's all very interesting. But what's also interesting is how much our attention is bought and sold. How much us being gathered together into these demographics, into viewerships, into people using certain social media, and how all of that is bought and sold by these big companies with lots of rich people who hoard our wealth. We've become the product. So we very, very realistically both occupy the media and the media occupies us. I happen to be a TikTok influencer, and TikTok pays me for how many people view my material. And that's cool. I dig that. Nice motivation to keep posting. And, I wish Twitter used to do that when one of my tweets was, retweeted by Mark Hamill and et cetera. Would have been good to get a penny every time somebody looked their eyes on it, because we are creating the media that they're selling. I'm a content creator, and yes, this means that people come forward and will offer money to me to try and sell their stuff, which of course I won't do. Unless something amazingly life-changing came along and wanted to pay me an amazing life-changing amount of money. All of that would be cool. But my point is that when we look at that unit of human media, dawn of time to the year 2006, that's being created every 3 days, we're creating it and selling it for other people. Free labor. There are more books published every year than there were ever published before the year 2000. Every year, more than all the books published before the year 2000. You can self-publish your own book. You can self-publish your own songs. All of these things, and they have great reach. But you know what would be nice? What would be nice is if you didn't have to make money for the really rich people, for your work, to help you make a living. You individually. For example, I don't know how much Spotify pays per listen. Let's say it's 5 cents. I think I'm being generous. You have to have millions of views to become wealthy, millions of listens to become wealthy through streaming music. But what if you didn't have to? What if you could publish your own album, and if you sold 10,000 copies, you were able to be set for that year, so you could work on another album and try to sell 10,000 copies next year? Why do we have to have our culture so in common with each other? Why is there no room for more? Why do we have such a steep curve to a pointed tip? And you have to be at the point of that tip. We think of actors. Actors make a fortune, right? Not most of them. Most of them make almost nothing. Most of them are working nearly for free or for exposure. Just the ones that you see are paid a lot of money. The payoff can be great if you hit it. But what if it didn't have to be that big? What if acting could be a more modest profession for more people? What if music could be a more modest profession for more people and not have to be, this whole don't give up your day job type bullshit where you have to sell insurance if you want to be a performer at night? I've done the thing where the bar tells you that they're going to pay you in 2 free drinks. And I've done the thing where you're told that you get to play this party and that the exposure will be amazing. Because they want you just to be buying lottery tickets, essentially. Buying, like everything you write, every performance you give is buying a lottery ticket that the right person at the right time will see you and then exploit you. They will see you and say, I can make a lot of money off this kid. And that'll benefit you. But it shouldn't be structured that way. We shouldn't have all of the power in the hands of the commerce people. And it's just so easy to do, There have been hit shows on YouTube that have been bought by networks only to not be made into a show anymore because they don't want the competition. There have been bands who've been signed by major labels only to never have their album produced because they don't want the competition. I knew a guy in Michigan who had a potato farm. And he had a contract with a giant potato producer from Idaho. He had a contract that his potato farm would yield no potatoes every year. It would be a potato farm, and he would not plant, and he would not harvest. He had to have the empty land there, and he couldn't even grow potatoes for himself because they don't want that supply flooding the market. So if we take a look at that and we extrapolate all of the creativity and all of the energy, all the passion of people out there who are trying to construct their own influence in the culture, their own spot, who are trying to express their own life story, their own point of view. And imagine that the richness of that is like that empty potato farm in so many ways. I'm not saying it's all valuable and it's all worth it to everybody or anything like that. And I do think the act of creating is by itself its value. Yeah, I do think everybody should try and write a memoir of some sort. It doesn't have to be any good. It probably won't be. And I do think musicians should make their own albums. They don't have to be any good. Post their shit on the internet. Yeah. But, I do think we should all make a podcast. Here I am. A guy sitting in his bedroom with a microphone, talking to, over the years, 8,000 people or so. Or me filming myself in my backyard, talking to 100,000 people every day. Wild. So we live in this time of great opportunity and also great control that we don't have access over. But we step back from this and able to separate the art from the machine, the commercials from the expression, the newness from the repackaged. There's a lot to benefit in this kind of access. There's a lot. And I feel like we should be more educated about it. I feel like one of the jobs of the school system should be to teach people how to access, analyze, and deploy information better. And I don't just mean looking up stuff at the library, using the right journals, using factual evidence. I love all that. Don't get me wrong. I love that. But I think that should be taught on a musical level. I think that should be taught on a storytelling level. I think that should be taught on a video gaming level. I'm not even kidding. I think that we should be teaching kids how to discern between what is culturally relevant because it's expressive and beautiful and innovative, and what is culturally relevant because somebody stands to make a lot of money from regurgitation. And I think that that kind of media literacy shouldn't be frowned upon because it's very serious and it's around us all the time. And I'm never going to say, well, we shouldn't learn algebra. I'm not one of those people. I think you should learn algebra. I think it's an interesting way to look at things. And believe me, the wave of time that is algebra class comes and goes. You're going to be okay, blah, blah, blah. But I do think that we need more media literacy. More ways of understanding what is being shown to us, more ways of being aware and being able to observe the commercials, the acting, the writing, the stories, the directing, the music that's coming at us every day. It's our culture. It's ourselves. It's part of who we are. Why don't we understand it better? Thank you very much. This is Soul Smith, part of your culture. Ha.